Okay, I'm just so unsure what's making me feel the way that I do sometimes. Yeah, Lily. I mean, if you're in that category of I don't know, and then you probably should get an evaluation. That's where I was at. I felt like nothing really made sense to me. Everything felt like a hodgepodge. I felt like there were a lot of diagnoses that the symptoms kind of overlapped and layered together. And I was like, so I personally went and saw a neuropsychologist and got a full neuropsychiatry workup and got a full evaluation to just assess me for the full gambit of everything's to try to discern what this full potential of overlapping symptoms could be. Because over the years, I had gotten a lot of weird diagnoses that I didn't feel fit and didn't feel made sense for me. So I wanted to have a better understanding. And I think that if you are in that category of, I don't really know, which is where I also was at, then I think that it does make sense to try to pursue a diagnostic evaluation. But if you look at a diagnosis and you just go, oh my God, this is my life. Like this is everything that I am. And everything in you says yes. And it makes everything in your life make more sense to look at yourself from that context. Then A, what harm does it cause? And B, do you need the clinical diagnosis? And I think that that's something that we need to start asking ourselves more as a society is what harm does it cause? There are a lot of people taking on labels that I look at and go, all right, that's weird, that I don't agree with their label and I think their label's strange and I can't imagine wanting to live that way. However, they're not hurting anybody and they feel more comfortable and more fulfilled living with these labels and in the context of these labels. And these labels, these sets of identity labels give their life more meaning and help them make sense of life. So why shouldn't they use them? If it's not causing anybody harm, why are we getting worked up about it, like as a society? And I think that when we talk about diagnostic labels, using them as a way for self-exploration, I don't know that there's any harm in that either. And so far, the only challenge that we have seen is that when a person self-diagnoses and then later goes into a clinician for evaluation and they get a different diagnosis than the one they self-diagnosed, it creates a lot of conflict and tension. And a lot of that conflict and tension comes from a lot of factors because, first of all, a lot of people are misdiagnosed initially. And that, secondly, this person has identified with the label that they have. So I think that if you're going to self-diagnose, that you need to do so with the understanding that it's a label, that it isn't part of who you are, and that if you go into treatment, it's possible that a clinician might not agree with your diagnosis. So... But yeah, there's a lot of discussion right now about labels in our society. And I think that neurodivergent and neurodivergency is definitely one of those labels. And I know that this is something that we've kind of talked some about before in this stream about like what is a neurodivergent, who falls under that umbrella. And we've kind of talked about like what diagnoses are included. And I know we talked about that in our Discord channel too. So I'm not sure how much of what we've talked in which places, honestly. But there's a lot of hurdles in knowing whether or not you should identify with it. And a lot of what I will say is it's a lot about whether or not you feel that that label makes sense for you and you feel that this label helps you in self-discovery. If you find that identifying yourself as a neurodivergent, as somebody who has a difference in their neurotype, is easier to work with and gives you a better explanation and a better ground to work on than one of a mental disorder or a mental illness. There's absolutely nothing wrong with with thinking of yourself in the context of neurodivergency rather than a mental disorder or a mental illness. I don't think that it changes the symptom set that anybody's talking about, and I don't think that it causes any harm to anyone. So, yeah. So, like, for me personally, I was diagnosed, I want to say somewhere around 25. I'm not super good at timelining. But I was an adult for sure. And again, I had a neuropsych eval, so I had a full neuropsychology workup. And what that means is that I went and saw a specialist who's both a neurologist and a psychiatrist, and they were evaluating me for disorders that can cause changes in mood and behavior that might be generated either from neurological problems or that could be caused by mental disorders. And they evaluate you for that whole gambit of things all at the same time. And the advantage to seeing somebody who is a neuropsychologist is that they are going to look at potential biological problems, the neurological problems is what I mean, and some of this is a language hurdle because yes, mental disorders are neurologically based, but we don't clinically call them neurological problems. And it's complicated and messy, and the language is weird. And this is, again, where it can be difficult to talk about these things. But neurological disorders do have a very defined parameter that is different than medical disorders. And yeah. These specialists are looking at both those. So the advantage is that you get looked at for more potential things because there are neurological disorders. One that comes into mind immediately is Parkinson's that can have impacts on mood and behavior. But it's absolutely a neurological disorder and doesn't fall underneath the category of a mental disorder. So having one person evaluate for everything is just a bigger umbrella, covers more things, especially if you're really, really just not sure what's going on. And where I had some movement disorder going on, it was entirely possible that the mood and behavior symptoms that I was having was because of a neurological problem and not because of a mental disorder. So we were like, what's going on? There was a lot of layers there. Yeah, I walked away with like a big, huge packet of information, and I got a bunch of diagnoses. Amongst them was the autism and ADHD diagnoses, and they really changed the way that I look at myself and the way that I evaluate how I interact with other people. I used to consider myself a failure at communication, and I used to consider myself really bad at communication because a lot of the communication that I had with people did not result in an effective exchange of information, which is the whole purpose of communication. When I came to understand that it was a difference of how I communicated and that I have auditory processing disorder and that I have a difference of reading paralanguage, and I knew that these things existed, I realized that, all right, so it's basically like trying to understand a different language, and this doesn't make me stupid or defective or a bad person or a failure in any way, shape, or form. It means that it's no different than someone who is German talking to someone who is Spanish and them trying to learn each other's languages in order to communicate. There are huge hurdles and barriers to that communication because they were born in different cultures. They have a different context. Their language base is different. The way, their paralanguage, all the nonverbal stuff is going to be different. So yeah, like it changed the way that I evaluate myself and judge myself. And I was able to give myself grace and say, I'm not this terrible failure of a person. I have a different language, and I'm speaking to people in a different language, and I have these barriers that exist when communicating with someone in a different language, and it therefore makes sense that there would be difficulty expressing ideas and having effective communications. Also, mental health is still evolving. Like, there's so much stuff still new. A lot of things are still changing. Example, diagnosis for women would definitely shouldn't be the same for diagnosis for men. Absolutely, ads. So that's the other thing about anything scientific we need to understand is that as the research for something progresses, it's going to change our understanding of. It's going to change our understanding of a diagnosis. It's going to change our understanding of how these things function. Years ago, we didn't know anything about DNA, and we didn't know anything about the influence that genetics had on all of the disorders within the DSM-5. So now we understand that there's this genetic predisposition that's programmed in our fundamental, DNA that dictates that there's this difference that that is influenced by the environment that creates this potential. That's what the science tells us now. And will the science evolve and then tell us that it's different than we thought in the future? Absolutely. It's going to continue to elucidate things. It's going to continue to expand on the ideas, and it's going to continue to clarify and bring forth new information. And as that happens, and as the research gets done better, and we start doing more inclusive research that includes more than white cisgendered men, and we start looking at women and people of color and transgender people and start including them in our research, we're going to start seeing how the differences of presentation exist within those groups. And when getting diagnosed, you have a lot to look up: the kind of therapist you're seeing, the age, the education, the views. Ideally, yes, ads. I mean, you don't necessarily have that as an option depending upon what your insurance is, depending upon who's available. But ideally, yeah, you should be matching the type of provider to your needs and your personal preferences. If you're not comfortable talking to a particular gender, then ideally you shouldn't have that gender as a therapist. If you're looking for therapy for depression, ideally you should have a therapist that specializes in depression. Yeah, absolutely. However, because these services are so limited, you might not have an option given what's covered by your insurance or what's available. Getting checked for mental health is definitely not the same as any other health issue. It can be kind of overwhelming when you think about it. Yeah, it is different because there aren't tests, so to speak. There isn't a lab work that can be done. There isn't a scan that can be done that will say you have this thing. So there's a lot of subjective bias that can cause problems for sure. So yeah, I think that all of this is evolving and already complicated, and is only going to get more complicated as things continue to evolve, for sure. And I will say that being diagnosed versus not being diagnosed. I have not gotten any services for my autism organization. For my autism disorder diagnosis. I have received services for my ADHD diagnosis. But for both, hands down, the biggest thing that I felt that these diagnoses gave me was a different lens with which to look at myself. They allowed me to realize that the challenges that I was having in society was not because I was somehow a defective, broken human being. It was because I was different than the people that I was interacting with, and that those differences were creating challenges. And that was what I needed to be able to give myself grace and give myself permission to not be perfect. And I don't know that everybody needs that in order to give themselves permission to not be perfect, but it made a huge difference for me. I received the message a lot as a child and even in young adulthood that I was a failure, that I was unwanted, that I didn't measure up to the standard, blah, blah, blah. So there was a lot of rejection in my life, and this rejection was very much internalized and very much led to this sense that I was a lesser person and unvalued, and definitely really had an impact on my self-esteem. So having the diagnosis meant that I was able to look at myself instead of being this broken, unwanted, defective, lazy, failing person as I'm different. I'm just a different type of human being. And I face different challenges that the world is not designed for. So for me, it was absolutely life-changing to have those diagnoses, even though I didn't get a whole bunch of services. One organization that I really try to steer people toward for autism stuff is Autism Self-Advocacy Network. I am not familiar with them, so I will have to check them out. And I am like making a note to myself now, or I will absolutely forget. We all know that I have mentioned this numerous times, that my memory is such that I don't remember any of the things. I hate how some people go like, nowadays everybody is autistic or has ADHD or whatever, but I like to think it's actually the fact that it's getting normalized and that there's less stigma, etc. So I'm glad to find more neurodivergence than before, and I'm not just stereotyped anymore. So there's a lot of layers to why there's more people diagnosed. Some of it is that we changed the diagnostic criteria. You can now be diagnosed ADHD as an adult. You couldn't be before. We broadened the autistic criteria and made it more of a spectrum disorder. So it included a lot of people that we were seeing clinically that we felt were in these that should be included in this diagnosis, but didn't actually meet the criteria. So part of it is that there was a change in criteria that did catch more people. The other part of it is that the research reflected that the group of people that we were previously focused on were not the only group of people that this disorder existed in. We were previously focused on only white males for, the cisgender white males for both ADHD and autism, and research has shown that that is absolutely not the case, that it is all races, that it is all both, all genders, all of that it's equally divided. There's no increased prevalence in any of these areas. So that's part of it now. And now that clinicians and the research is, now that research is reflecting that, the clinical diagnosis is beginning to also reflect that. And the other darker part of this history is that historically there was an era where groups of populations in this country were being sterilized so that they were not having children. And because of that, many of these groups of people were not having the children that would lead to the individuals that are now being diagnosed, which is one of the groups of people. Like, if you look at our history, it wasn't until the mid-70s that the sterilization programs really came to a grinding halt. And we were pretty routinely sterilizing people who were of color and who had mental health diagnoses. And this is a pretty black being affected. So you didn't see as many people with neurodivergence who were colored individuals because we were sterilizing them. So they weren't having children. And it's a fucking horrific reality in our history, but that's absolutely part of what was happening. So there's a lot of layers, a lot of layers as to why there's more people being diagnosed. Knowing people more deeply is actually more interesting than you think, especially people with autism. It's kind of interesting to listen to them on what they are, and sometimes some people are really complex to understand. I think that everyone is complex to understand, whether they're neurotypical or neurodivergent, whether they have chronic illness or they're able-bodied, whether they are colored or black, white, or whether any label a person carries. I feel that every human being is complex and layered, and it is very rare that I've never met anybody that carries only one of these identity labels. We all have multiple layered labels, and therefore we have, as an individual, this onion existence. So it's impossible for somebody with autism to look like somebody else with autism because their onion layer identities are going to be different. Same thing with two people with ADHD, same thing with two people who are neurotypical. Humans are very complex, and I think that people are absolutely fascinating and interesting and wonderful to get to know. And I think that if we were more embracing in society, we would be able to better explore and celebrate the good things that are happening. I was once told while in the service that back in the day, we'd just beat that out of you in reference to a comment about having ADHD as a kid. Yeah, Kermit Schaffer, that was definitely in my era growing up in the 80s. I was one of the beaten children. The growing up ADHD, the belief was that corporal punishment would force you to behave. Now, I will say that corporal punishment absolutely taught me to mask, and that it absolutely made it difficult for me to get a diagnosis because of that mask. And it has made it so that that mask is almost a part of me now, because I've masked for so long that I don't even really know where the mask ends and I myself begin. But that is how they treated us. That is how they dealt with the difference. Whether you were autistic or ADHD or had depression or had any other undesirable trait, it was very common to just use corporal punishment as a, I'm going to punish you for undesirable behavior, and I will make you be afraid to commit that behavior again, and therefore you will behave the way that I want you to behave out of fear. And it was effective, and masking exists, and a lot of us are very good at masking. Yes, definitely glad that those days are gone. Places where people were treated like animals, giving them pills to keep them numb, lobotomies, etc. Seriously terrible. Yeah, ads, it was horrific. And I won't say that that behavior is completely gone. We still have had some really pretty horrific behaviors, cases happening even in more current history, but at least it is not the mainstream standard approach. And that was also for people with other medical issues and not just mental health. Absolutely, ads. This was something that was done for a whole plethora of things. It wasn't just for autism and ADHD, absolutely. But that is also a part of why those numbers are increasing, is because people with mental disorders and neurodivergencies were considered undesirable, especially in non-white populations, and they were being sterilized, and therefore they weren't having children. And where these disorders have a strong genetic component, where there's this genetic tendency that is influenced by environmental factors, you know, if you sterilize the people who carry those genetic tendencies, you're going to reduce the number of people in the population who are presenting with those tendencies. I don't know if I'm considered to be in one of the groups, but apparently my professor said that I'm possibly autistic due to my really high IQ and I have social anxiety disorder. Well, Kyle Koala, you can have a really high IQ and not be autistic, and you can have anxiety disorder and have IQ. You can have those things and not be autistic. However, having social anxiety is very common with autism and ADHD. But it's not, if you're questioning it and you feel like it's something that you would like to know, then I would say, you know, go pursue a diagnosis. But I would say that your professor is falling into the world of stereotypes. You can absolutely have a really high IQ and social anxiety disorder and it not be autism. 100%, I went off my meds at 14. I promise I still have it, but the military doesn't know that because I'd get the boot. I just masked the hell out of it, and that cope has become my existence. Yeah, Kermit Schaffer. So, and that's part of the debate about diagnosis and whether or not diagnosis has value. And if you self-identify and self-diagnose, you don't face some of the challenges that you face if you have a clinical diagnosis. If you have a clinical diagnosis, there are technically areas that you can face prejudice, and military service is one of them. If you have ADHD or autism, you are not supposed to be able to serve in the military. That is in fact true. And if it is a self-diagnosis, however, that doesn't apply. So this is one of the reasons why many people are choosing self-diagnosis as an option. Having to mask to survive makes things difficult in the long run. That's a complicated thing to talk about. So I think that that's true, Atchi. And I think that the reason for that is because it requires a lot of energy to, or spoons as we refer to in the chronic illness, to mask. And it requires that constant diligence and effort, whether we realize that we're doing it or not. And this is why people frequently refer to autistic burnout. And this is the phenomenon where someone has been masking heavily and masking effectively to be able to blend into society, but then they reach a point where their stressors have become too heavy and too demanding that they no longer have sufficient energy or sufficient spoons or sufficient resources to address all the stressors in their life and mask at the level necessary to continue to function well in society. So they begin to burn out and they begin to have this crisis state. The other reason that we are seeing people have what we refer to as autistic burnout is because of this incongruency of how you feel on the inside as a person and how you identify and who you feel like you are and how you're presenting to the world doesn't match. And that feels like a lie, and it feels like a dishonesty, and it feels like lacking genuineness, and it feels like you're being a robot. And it challenges the ethical values that many people with autism carry. So I would argue that masking always comes with a heavy price, and that masking always risks burnout, whether you have ADHD or autism. It doesn't matter what you're masking. There's a high rate of PTSD and burnout in individuals who feel that they have to hide their symptoms, whether those symptoms are for depression, ADHD, or schizophrenia, or whatever. This week, I'm going to get myself checked with my psychiatrist since I am having weekly mental therapies because I'm currently working on my PTSD and my social anxiety disorder. Yeah, if you're questioning your diagnosis, it absolutely makes sense, especially if you're already seeing somebody. Yeah, totally makes sense to question your, to touch base with them about getting an evaluation. What's even crazier is that ADHD and depression go hand in hand. It's made getting officially diagnosed with PTSD a nightmare because all I keep getting was, oh, you just had ADHD, we'll treat that. Oh, it's depression on top of that, we'll treat that too. All the while, I'm not being listened to saying there's something more going on, but was ignored because apparently I was attention seeking. Yeah, Kermit, the whole attention-seeking narrative drives me absolutely freaking bonkers. I can't even speak to how much the attention-seeking phrase I think needs to go away. It drives me nuts. Of course, every human being has needs, biological need to be paid attention to. So, first of all, why is seeking attention a negative, bad thing? Why does it make you a terrible person that you seek attention when every human being has a biological need for that to be met? Drives me nuts. Like, every human needs human connection. That's scientifically very well established. So why are we shaming people for seeking out a need to be met? Secondly, having another need does not mean that it is about that social seeking, and that dismissiveness drives me bonkers. And I don't know how we get past that hurdle, other than demanding that providers do better at staying mindful of the patient experience and listening to the individual patient experience, which is going to be different and individualized for every person. Well, that hasn't come out recently. that one we choose, and I suppose it should be at the bottom of the box. Yeah, maybe that is what's going on. Maybe you're like, oh, I haven't seen this hat for a while, so I'm going to choose it, and therefore that's why it's at the bottom of the box. Because you're right, I do just when I take them off, put them on the top. But I just find it amusing that every time I go to find the hat you've looked for, I'm like digging in crazy, and it takes me forever to find it. And you're staring at the wall while I'm looking for hats. And yeah, we definitely won't hold mistyping against you because I can't talk or type properly, whether I have all the best tools. So it's fine.